Hello and welcome to the Mind Report. My name is Laurie Santos. I'm a professor of psychology at Yale University.
And I'm Jason Mitchell. I'm professor of psychology at Harvard University.
And today Jason and I are going to be talking about the new field of social neuroscience and what it can tell us about mind reading, both reading our own mind and talking about other people's minds as well. So Jason, just to get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about what this field of social neuroscience is? For those that don't know, Jason is kind of one of the leading young researchers in this new field, so I thought it'd be fun to have him tell us a little bit about how it works and what it is. So, Jason, what's social neuroscience?
So, one of the primary assumptions within much of psychology is that the human mind is basically a set of algorithms or little programs that run, and each of these little bits of the algorithm or each of these little bits of software help us accomplish some task, endow us with some ability in everyday life. So there might be programs that help me remember, what happened in the past, or programs that help me move my hand away when I feel pain. And we assume that some of these programs, some of these parts of the algorithm are helping us guide our behavior and our thoughts when we interact with other people. So the goal of social cognitive neuroscience sort of broadly is to understand the nature of those algorithms, to understand something about what's the step-by-step recipe by which we might, for instance, see a person smile and ultimately understand that he is hoping that we'll come into his shop and buy something. So now it turns out that one of the very powerful ways that we can get some traction on questions like that is to look at what the brain is doing when it's involved in these various kinds of tasks. So I guess in the broadest sense, what the goal of social cognitive neuroscience is to try to understand the neural basis of how we interact successfully with other people, and the reason for trying to understand the sort of neural basis is ultimately, I think, to understand what this kind of recipe is by which we make sense of the minds of others.
Yeah, and so, but folks have been using the kind of cognitive neuroscience approach for some time to kind of look at cognitive processing broadly. Why is looking at social cognition special, or is it special?
Yeah, I think people are of two minds here, and I'm of two minds here. I think there's part of me that thinks, look, there isn't really anything special about the field of social neuroscience. I think there are things that humans can do, and some of those we group as being cognitive. So my use of language, or being able to switch my attention from one spot to the other, or being able to perceive color, all of those things that we traditionally think of cognitive psychologists as studying. And then there are things that we do in everyday life that involve other people. And one way to think about it is that those aren't really different in kind. That is, one could imagine that there are algorithms, software for perceiving color, and there's software for perceiving faces. And what social neuroscience is the sort of study of the algorithm or the cognitive processes or the recipe for making sense of other people. That said, it turns out that there are interesting properties of social cognition, which I think many people didn't anticipate before we began looking at how the brain allows us to do this stuff. So, I think if you had canvassed psychologists or neuroscientists in the late 80s or early 90s and said, what's the brain going to look like when one person is interacting with another person? I think most people would have said, look, it's going to be a huge mess. It's going to be a mishmash of all sorts of different regions that are involved in perception, that are involved in understanding language, that are involved in executive functions and attention, etc. And basically what you're going to see is that the whole brain is active when you do something as difficult or as involved as interacting with other people. And instead what we find is very interesting, which is that so starting in the mid-90s, when the technology began to develop and such that we could look and see what brains do when they interact with other brains, what we see is that there are a relatively small number of brain regions, maybe 4, 5, 6 in number, depending on how you count. And those regions are consistently active whenever one person is interacting with another person. And they seem to seem to form a sort of network that sits very separate from lots of the other things that we do outside of the social world.
Oh, that's cool. And so you've been looking at a couple of areas in this network kind of in particular. So tell me a little bit about some of the regions you guys look at and kind of show us, if you can, kind of in the video, sort of where they are so our listeners get a chance to see where this stuff is in their own head.
Yeah. So there are a few. So the one that we focus most on, and I think one of the regions that probably comes up most consistently in the study of social cognition, is a region known as the medial prefrontal cortex, which is a nice name because it tells you exactly where it is. It's in the prefrontal cortex, so it's in the front of your brain, and it's medial, so it's effectively in line with your nose.
Yep.
So that's one region that has been of interest to social neuroscientists. Another is a region known as the temporal parietal junction. Again, nicely named because it tells you roughly where it is. So this is at the junction of the temporal cortex and the parietal cortex. So you might think about it sort of in here, maybe sort of a couple inches above your temples. And then a couple of other regions. One is a region that's sometimes called the precuneus or the posterior cingulate. So more or less behind basically underneath the sort of crown of your head. And then, again, depending on how you count and depending on exactly what you ask people to do, there are other regions like the superior temporal sulcus, which sort of runs up along here, or some even more ventral regions like the amygdala or the fusiform gyrus, which are sort of on the undersurface of the brain.
So give us a sense of what this network is doing, like some of the tasks you've given to participants, just so we can get a sense of kind of what engages this region and what kind of cognitive processes it's up to.
Yeah. So the history of this network is really interesting. So it first came to the attention of sort of a group of cognitive psychologists who got interested in social stuff when they began to sort of ask participants to basically make reference to the mind of someone else. So the task might be something, basically anything where you're asked to say something about what another person knows, what another person understands, what another person believes, or what that person's like as a person, his personality characteristics, or what a person might be feeling or thinking at any given time. So a couple of the very early tasks were things like, here's an object, it's a compact disc player or something. Do you think Christopher Columbus would know what this object was? And if you compared that task to what the brain was doing when subjects were answering questions like that, and you looked at what the brain was doing when you asked a question like, here's a compact disc player, is this bigger or smaller than a bread box? What you showed is that these regions, the medial prefrontal cortex, temporal parietal junctions, were very active when they were thinking about what Christopher Columbus might know, but didn't care at all about the question of whether this was bigger than a bread box. That's just one example. So we now have, there might be, I'm going to just guess, but there's several dozen different kinds of tasks like this, compared against all sorts of different kinds of control tasks. And what the consistent finding is that in any task where you ask individuals to make an inference about what another person's thinking or feeling, these regions are much more active than when you're engaged in some non-social, non-mental state kind of task.
Cool. And your work has shown that this isn't just about thinking about other people, thinking about Christopher Columbus or kind of random folks, that we also seem to use a similar sort of network when we're thinking about ourselves and our own preferences.
That's right. So one question that I think very quickly became of interest to individuals looking at this network was, what does it mean when I say these regions care about mental states and minds? Because it's not just other people with whom we interact that have minds, and you can think of a number of different other entities that this set of regions might care about. And it turns out, after we and many other labs have done research, that these regions also care about the mental states of non-human animals. So if I say that my dog is curious or hungry or really wants to play, these regions are just as active as if I said that about my sister. These regions also are active when I anthropomorphize objects that don't really have mental states, but about which we often think that their mental state. So if I say that my computer is out to harm me, or that my car is very cranky, these regions might also be engaged. And it turns out that, and I think again a little bit surprisingly in some sense, that one of the things that this set of regions cares about are the mental states of oneself. So just like I can think about what another person might do or what a good gift for another person might be, these regions are also quite active when I introspect about my own internal states, my own thoughts and feelings, or my own personality characteristics.
This is kind of one of my favorite things about your work, because I think, to lay people, we might not initially think that we actually have to use a lot of computational processing to get at our own preferences, like whether I'm hungry or tired or whatever. I should have direct access to it. But some of the work you've been looking at suggests that we actually have to use the same tricky computational processes that we use for other people, sometimes even to look at our own preferences.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think there's an interesting question about how it is we know, how it is we judge our own preferences and make decisions based on them. And I think there are economic models and cognitive models and now emerging neural models about how we do that. So, when I look at a restaurant menu and I have to choose one of 8 different entrees for dinner, what are the actual processes that take place that allow me to do that? Because it's not simply a matter of, well, I'm the kind of guy who always eats chicken, so tonight I'm going to eat chicken as well. If I go back to the same restaurant a month later, I might order something very different. So there's some kind of machinery going on that allows me to introspect and arrive at some answer to the question of what is it that I want, let's say, right now.
Mm-hmm. I know so lots of work in cognitive scientists has shown that there are some spots where we're kind of bad at this. And you focused on one particular area where we're bad at it, which is our figuring out the preferences that our future selves might have. Do you want to speak to that a bit?
Yeah, so we became very interested in the question of, so lots of people, behavioral economists especially, have been interested in the question of why humans are not better at making decisions about what's going to make them happy. And so there are many examples where the kinds of choices we make now seem to have deleterious or suboptimal effects for our future selves. And all of us experience this all the time. So we might indulge in an extra pint at the bar or an extra piece of chocolate cake now because it makes us feel good, even though we're fully aware that the person we're going to be when we wake up tomorrow or the next week would have preferred us not to do that we're going to be sorry for having done that kind of thing.
Right. We're recording this now in the first week of January, where everyone's New Year's resolutions are on people's mind right now. And, of course, our data show that, a month from now, all of us are going to have forgotten our resolutions, even though our future selves might have been happier if our past selves actually, did a good job with them and stuff. So
that's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. And the way that economists have sort of operationalized this traditionally is to look at the kinds of choices people make with regard to money. So one of the very fun things you can do as a professor in intro psych is to pick someone in the audience and say, look, here's the deal. I'll give you $10 right now. You can show the person the $10. You can have this right now. Or when we come back for class next week, I'll give you $15. And what you find is that more often than not, the person will take the $10 in hand and forego this later larger reward. Even though that can't be optimal. I mean, you're offering a 50% return for waiting, 5 days or whatever it is. So the reason we got interested in this question is because we had been doing work looking at differences looking at how this set of brain regions that I described earlier, how that set of regions differentiates between people you know well and that you feel like you're similar to, and those that you don't know very well and feel dissimilar to. And what we found is that if I'm interacting with somebody who I have reason to believe thinks and feels like I think and feel, then what I tend to do is engage the same kinds of machinery that I do when I think about my own thoughts and feelings. But that's very different than when I interact with somebody who I have reason to believe is relatively dissimilar from me, and in which case I engage very different kinds of machinery. So we thought, look, what if one of the reasons why we're having such a hard time being good to our future selves is that we don't always think about him as a similar other, as somebody who's like me. We might consider our future selves as being not quite a stranger, but somebody whose goals and wants are very much not in line with ours.
Okay.
Who might have, and so I'll just tell you a little bit about the way that we actually ran this experiment, because I think it's sort of the easiest way to think about this.
Yeah.
What we did was we used fMRI to scan participants while they engage in a very simple task. And the task is, consider this activity and tell us how much you would like to engage in that activity. So it might be something like, get up at dawn to watch the sunrise.
Okay.
And the only thing that we manipulate is whether subjects are asked, how much would you like to do this in the next 24 hours? So basically now. Mm-hmm. How much would you like to do this a year from now? That is, how much would your future self enjoy doing this? Mm-hmm. So a couple things happen. One is that subjects believe that their future selves are going to want to do these things more. The tasks are things that are sort of onerous. We all want to be the kind of person who gets up to watch the sunrise. But none of us really wants to do tomorrow. And that's what subjects say. They believe that their future self is going to enjoy these things more than their current self will.
Is that only for onerous things, or is that actually for positive things too? So do we think our future selves like positive things less than we like positive things now? Do we know that?
We didn't manipulate that. We haven't yet manipulated that extensively. What mm-hmm. we do know is that when we ask people questions like, how much would you like to spend an afternoon playing video games? People mm-hmm. think that their future self won't enjoy that as much as they would themselves now. Huh. Because nobody wants to be the kind of person who sits around all afternoon and plays video games, but it is actually kind of enjoyable.
Right. Our future selves are very virtuous, apparently. Or at least
yeah, they're better. They're much better people than we are now.
Yeah.
I hope so, in my case. So we found a couple things. So one, which was of interest to us, was these regions that care about similar others and that basically that care about thinking about similar others are mm-hmm. generally less involved when you think about your future self, as if you're thinking about her as some dissimilar person who might have very different goals or very different thoughts and feelings. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't true for everybody. So some people show that difference between current self and future self in a huge way, and others basically seem to treat their future self a lot like a similar other, a lot like they treat themselves now. Mm-hmm. And what we were able to show is that if you're the kind of person who treats your future self as being somebody very dissimilar, you're also the kind of person who tends to make impatient monetary choices. So you're the kind of person
who takes the $10 today rather than the $12 tomorrow.
Yep, that's exactly right. You'll take the $10 now instead of waiting a week for $12. If you're the kind of, and there were hints of this in the data, and we haven't yet followed through on this, but those people are also more likely to have larger credit card debt. They're also more likely to smoke. They're more likely to drink to excess. So it may be that there's sort of a general kind of cluster of traits that seem to involve this treating your future self as someone very dissimilar or disparate from you. The people who didn't show any difference between current self and future self in the brain were those mm-hmm. who were, as you put it, very virtuous. They're the ones who are willing to wait indefinitely for another, $5 or $10 or whatever it is.
I mean, so this raises the tricky question about, how do I start recruiting these regions that I use to think about my present self, to think about my future self, right? Stick with the resolutions and be a more virtuous person in the future. Do we know anything about how you can manipulate that?
Yeah. Well, we do and we don't. So, and it hasn't been our group that's really looked all that much at that particular issue, but it is an issue that behavioral economists and policymakers have been very interested in because there are real world consequences to failing to treat your future self with the same respect that you treat your current self. So just to take an example, it's notoriously difficult to encourage people to save for retirement. This is a classic case where I'd really rather have the extra $200 a month in my checking account right now, and I don't really want to put into my IRA or my 401k, because that's some person 25 years from now who's going to enjoy that. But of course, that has if everybody acts that way, it has disastrous consequences for our collective old age. So one very simple thing that you can do, and this will sound familiar to people who've tried to keep commitments, is you basically, well, there are a couple of things. One thing you do is you set defaults that are very different than the standard default. So let me give you an example. So if the default is when you start working for a company that you have to actively sign up for a 401k, very few people actually go through the bother of doing it. But if the default is you're automatically enrolled in the 401k and you have to do something active to get out of it, basically most people stay put. There's a lot of inertia and people effectively do whatever the default actually is. One great example of this is if you look at organ donation rates in countries where the default is that you're not an organ donor, but you have to sign up to be one. Those rates are usually something like 8 or 10 times less than in countries where the default is you are an organ donor and you have to opt out. So that's one simple thing you can do. Another thing that people, again, and this is we've known about this since since the ancients at least, is the tying yourself to the mast. Basically, committing yourself in such a way that it's very difficult to not follow through. So, for instance, you might pay a lot of money to join a gym and then feel bad about not being able to not getting your money's worth. So you basically pay all the cost up front and then feel as though you have to make good on what you've done. Or you commit in such a way that there's really no way for you to get out of what it is you're doing. So yeah, it's going to be really onerous when I have to get up and help my friend move next week. But if I pre-commit to doing it now, I kind of feel locked in a way. So locking yourself in is another good strategy for dealing with this.
But all of those are kind of interventions that aren't kind of intervening at the way we read minds, right? Like all those are kind of assuming, well, I'm probably going to be bad at mind reading my future self, because I've been in the past or whatever. So I'll set up all these other kind of nudges down the line. Do we know any way that we can actually get better at reading other minds or treating our future self not like a stranger? Yeah.
So there seems to be one really good way, which you might think of as being forms of perspective taking. So one thing we've seen before is if you do encounter other people, you can increase the extent to which you view that person as similar to you by spending some time actively, consciously taking that person's perspective. So I think to myself, what is it like to be Laurie Santos and a professor at Yale? And to the extent that I can kind of richly simulate or imagine your own experience, kind of put myself in your shoes, the more likely I am to treat you as a similar other and to use the same machinery that I use when I think about myself.
So the idea is I'm at the bar trying to think about whether or not taking the next glass of wine is a good thing, and I think about myself. I have to perspective take on myself tomorrow morning when I have to get up for work. And
That's exactly right.
What are my preferences, et cetera, et cetera.
That's exactly right. So that is one thing that you can do is to actively, it sounds trite, but I don't think we often do it, which is to actively, richly imagine what the consequences will be for your future self. And to imagine whether that person will have been happy or sad that you're making the choice that you are right now. I mean, one it's in this vein, but it's a little bit of a twist on exactly how to do this. Is it's sometimes helpful to imagine whether you would want to do something right now if asked. So another thing that we often have trouble with is committing to things that we're then sorry we committed to. So a friend might invite you to a wedding, an acquaintance might invite you to a wedding at some faraway place, and you say yes, but then when July comes around and you actually have to schlep all the way out to Nebraska, you're kind of sorry for having to do it. So one thing you can do is to actually imagine, like, okay, if the wedding were this weekend, would I want to do it? And if the answer is no, chances are your future self is also not going to want to do it.
Mm-hmm. That's good. So we need to actually think about whether we're virtuous enough right now to do this thing rather than commit our future self to it down the line.
Yeah.
If we're virtuous enough right now to take it on and we'd like it right now, then great. But if not, just forego the opportunity or
Right.
don't commit to all this crazy travel. Mine is always crazy travel and chapters, as I'm sure yours is as well.
That's right. I mean, all of this raises an interesting kind of philosophical question, which is who really gets to decide what the right thing to have done is, right? So, maybe the person right before packing for that wedding in Nebraska is sorry for having committed, but it might be the person who has gone to that wedding a week later is quite happy to have done so. So, I don't know that any of this says. None of this is a prescription for how to actually lead one's life. It's more a prescription for how to avoid those situations where you're kicking yourself for having agreed to do something or for having made some choice in the past that you're sorry to have made.
Yeah, and this isn't true. I mean, this isn't true just for cases where you're making decisions about how to spend your time later, right? I mean, we're often in a position of giving up rights or giving up all kinds of things that our future selves might want, right? Like think of cases of contracts, right, where I sign away my rights at time one, thinking that I'll have certain preferences at time two, but if I have trouble accessing those preferences, then it makes it difficult to even take into account different contracts and how I would deal with those down the line. So there's all kinds of things even in our legal system that I think assume that we have better access to our future selves' preferences than it seems like we really do.
That's right. Yeah, and I think the view that we've been interested in trying to explore is that that your future selves really are another person. That is, they pose the same problem to you that another person sitting in front of you poses, which is there's this other thing with mental states that are not the same ones that you have in your head right now, and your goal is to figure out what those mental states are, or in the case of your future self, what those mental states will be. And it's not obvious how you go about solving that problem in a trivial easy, immediate way.
Yeah. Another thing your work's been showing, too, is just that it's not just our own access to our future preferences. It can also be our access to our preferences now, and that sometimes our own preferences can be manipulated by the preferences of those around us, too. So I understand that you, in collaboration with some other folks, have been looking at the ways that finding out about other people's preferences can immediately affect our own and how rewarding we find things. Do you want to talk a little bit about some of that new work?
Sure, yeah. So there's, as many people know, there's a very long literature on social influence dating back to the 20s and 30s. The classic example is the studies by Solomon Asch looking at how one can get participants to say that an obviously wrong answer is actually the right one. So these are the classic line experiments where your goal is to say, is A, B, or C the line that matches the standard? And what you can show is that if enough other people around you are giving the wrong answer, chances are you'll go along with the crowd. Now, one interesting question in that kind of research and many of the kinds of studies that came after it is when people give you that answer, is it because they really deep down inside believe that that's the right answer because 10 other people said it was B, they believe that it's B? Or are they really just kind of saying, are they basically just explicitly saying that, but deep down inside they don't really believe it?
Right. They're going with the flow, but they haven't changed their own beliefs.
That's right. They're complying with the sort of demands of the task, but they haven't internalized that as their belief.
Yep.
So this is a case where it turned out the brain can be very useful for distinguishing between cases where people are merely complying explicitly but don't really change their belief versus ones where subjects really deep down inside perceive the world differently. So we didn't do lines on OCTAG or anything, but what we did was we had a group of male participants. You'll see why it was male participants in a second. And they first, before anything else, we have them view a series of female faces. And for each face, they're asked, can you tell us on a scale from 1 to 7 how attractive you find this person?
Much more fun than line judgments, I imagine, for your subjects.
I'm sorry?
I said much more fun for your subjects than line judgments, I imagine.
That's right. A lot more attractive to them. So the manipulation is immediately after each face, they are told what what an ostensible group of peers has said about that face. So they're told, look, we also canvassed another 200 college students who are a lot like you, and here's what they believe about the face. So they're told for each face that others found this person much more attractive than the subject did, much less attractive, or roughly the same. And there's another condition where they don't get told any feedback, that we didn't have enough answers about this face. Okay. Part 2, we put subjects in the scanner and we use fMRI to look at what their brain is doing when they see these faces a second time. Now, all they're doing the second time is just watching the faces as they go by. They're not.
And Jason, was the feedback actually real, or was it did you just fake the other participants' ratings?
No, yeah. So the feedback is manipulated by us. So
I see. So it's not real feedback about what people think.
That's right. So the faces, right, exactly. So we randomly tell them that this is a face that people thought was less attractive or more attractive. So it's nothing to do with the faces. We're just arbitrarily deciding that this is one we're going to say is less attractive than the other.
Yep.
So what researchers have found in the past, not us, is that there's a brain region known as the nucleus accumbens, sometimes known as the ventral striatum. Part of the nucleus accumbens is the ventral striatum. And this region is very responsive to rewarding stimuli. So if you give someone yummy juice or yummy food or a snort of cocaine, this region is very active. In many people, it's also quite active when you view attractive members of the opposite sex for heterosexual participants. So what we found is exactly that, which is, this ventral striatum region is more active for attractive faces than for unattractive faces. But what we also found, and this is the critical part, is that if you take a whole bunch of faces that subjects had originally said were in the middle of the scale, let's say a 4 out of 7, and you compare ones where they're told, hey, everybody else thought this person was a 5, to ones where they're told, hey, everybody else thought this person was a 3, what you also show is that the striatum differentiates those, as if the faces that were all rated initially the same have become more attractive if everybody else said they were, and have become less attractive if everybody else said they were less attractive. So this striatum region seems to be incorporating the feedback from this group of other people and changing the neural representations associated with faces that were all originally rated as the same.
And so that suggests that people in your task aren't just complying. They're not just saying, oh, I think that face is more attractive just, because they want to not upset you or they don't want to look bad or whatever. They're actually really changing the way their brain responds to these faces in terms of how rewarding they are to them personally.
Yeah, that's right. It's a way of using the brain as sort of the ultimate implicit measure. It's one in which you can bypass many of the concerns about I'm going to give the experimenter, I'm going to tell the experimenter what he wants to know, because we're not even asking subjects to do anything. Their brains are just reporting back something that seems to imply that they actually now view some faces as more attractive because everybody else saw them as more attractive.
That's great. And you've been able to use the same technique of kind of using the brain as the ultimate implicit measure in the context of altruistic giving as well, right? Where there's a sort of similar question when you put people in a situation where they get to give money to other participants or do nice things for other participants. Are they just kind of doing it to seem nice in front of the experimenter, or do they really kind of find those actions rewarding? Do you want to talk about some of those studies quickly too?
Yeah. So you're totally right. So there's another interesting question about why people act as nicely as they do to others, and why in particular individuals seem to, at least some of the time, are willing to give of their resources, their time or their money, even when they don't expect anything in return. And there are great stats if you look at, the Americans give roughly $200 billion in charity every year in terms of their time and money. The sort of standard social science model of what's going on there is that people are ostensibly doing nice things, but effectively because they are concerned about any negative repercussions that might befall them if they don't do those things. So if I don't agree to, go to your wedding or help you move, you will, tell other people I'm a real jerk, or you'll do something mean to me in the future, or you won't do something nice for me when I ask you in the future. So because of all those fears of negative consequences, I wind up being
a nice person, basically. Yeah.
Exactly. I get channeled into doing nice things. At the same time, people have talked about how humans, at least some of the time, report feeling really good about doing good things. That there's an idea that engaging in altruistic behavior has a sort of warm glow associated with it. So what we did is to give subjects, while we're scanning them, a situation in which they are making choices about whether they're going to take a certain amount of money or whether they're going to forego that to give another amount of money to others. So the task might be, I get to choose, do I take $1 for myself, or do I forego that dollar and give some other person $5? And in cases like that, subjects are often willing to say, look, it's the better thing to do to give that $5 to the other person.
Yeah.
And now this is the interesting result is the standard social science model would say, in order to do that, I have to overcome all of my selfish tendencies, all of the tendencies to grab the money for myself. And what you should show in the brain is all of the regions that are associated with that kind of effortful executive control. Mm-hmm. But that's not what we find at all. We don't see any hint that subjects are struggling to suppress or inhibit or put the cap on these tendencies. Instead, when subjects freely give this money to another person, we again show this region of the nucleus accumbens ventral striatum that is associated with rewarding events, which is associated in general with cases where you get yummy food or yummy drinks or money or look at attractive faces. And that implies that subjects, at least on average, are viewing opportunities to give money to others as a source of reward in and of itself, of the same kind as receiving yummy food or looking at attractive people.
That's cool. And do you see individual differences in that? Do they track kind of how much people can better simulate others and so on? Or
there are. So it is interesting. There are individual differences. So there's incredible variability on this kind of task, where some people are doing the altruistic thing most of the time, and there are other cases where there are individuals never doing the altruistic thing. We haven't yet figured out why that's the case. Is it simply that some subjects don't like playing the game that experimenters set up, or is it the case that some individuals really are less virtuous than others?
Right.
What we have shown is that
pulling your work together, you might think that like the extent to which I'm better able to simulate your preferences using the same machinery I do to simulate my own, right? If I think about your rewards and using the same machinery I do to think about my own rewards, then maybe that would make me more likely to give to you, or more likely to find it rewarding when you do get some money.
Yeah, and that is something that we found. So in related work, what we've had subjects do is just they're answering some questions about another person. So how much do you think Joe over here enjoys anchovies on pizza, right? Kind of trivial things. Some subjects really engage that brain machinery that I talked about earlier, the medial PFC, the temporal parietal junction, when they are engaged in that task. Others engage it less so. And you might think about that being a marker of how much you're really truly engaging with the mind of Joe in this case. What we find is that the people who really deeply engage with the mind of this other person are also those people who are the most generous to that person. So they're the most generous in terms of they're the most likely to give money to that other person on the kind of task I described earlier. But they're also more likely to do something which we found very interesting, which is to donate their time to that person. So I don't have the opportunity to talk in detail about this, but we set up a sort of elaborate cover story where their subjects are told that Joe, this other person, has been spending the last hour engaged in some onerous task, answering LSAT questions that he's really struggling with. And we tell the participant that after they've already been in the scanner for a couple of hours and are probably pretty tired, that it would be really helpful if you wouldn't mind kind of helping him out and spending some time doing some of these questions yourself. He can go home earlier, etc. And what we find is that individuals who've really deeply engaged with Joe's mind are those subjects who are the most likely to sit and answer lots of these questions for a long time for the benefit of the other person.
That's cool. And so do you think you could also manipulate that with the perspective-taking kinds of manipulations you were talking about earlier? If you get people to kind of really think about what's going on inside the other person's head in terms of whether they like anchovies and so on, do you think you can manipulate how rewarding it is when they give to that other person?
Yeah, we haven't yet done that, but that's something that's on the docket. So I think, I mean, that's the obvious prediction, and I think that's
yeah.
We'll see. Yeah.
I mean, another thing this reminds me of is that, as you probably know, in social psychology and charitable giving, there's this funny bias called the identifiable victim effect, right? Where people are much more likely to donate time and money if there's kind of one particular individual that they can identify with versus, millions of individuals or just kind of statistics about how bad it is and so on. Do you think that these regions and the extent to which we utilize these regions has anything to do with that sort of bias?
Yeah, I think there's a quote that I'm reminded of, and I forget who it's by, but somebody was talking about how to understand the plight of starving Chinese. This was in the 50s, and the advice he gave, facetiously of course, was what you should do is just imagine the mind of one Chinese individual, and then just multiply by 1 billion, and that will be the way to understand the experience of this large group of individuals. And of course, the problem with that is that's the machinery we have, the sort of cognitive apparatus that we are making use of, probably evolved to understand the mental states of a small number of individuals, and maybe really
one person at a time, maybe, right? Yeah.
And maybe only can tackle one individual at a time. So I think one way to think about what's going on with something like the identifiable victim effect is that we're just basically unable to use this social cognitive machinery to adequately make sense of what is going on with large numbers of individuals who might be in need.
Mm-hmm. That's cool. Well, I think we are just about out of time, but thank you, Jason, for telling us about some of our own glitches in our own mental state processing and what we can do. Hopefully some of our listeners will be able to use all that you've told them to make themselves better in the new year. But thanks so much.
Okay, thank you, Laurie.
See you soon. Bye.